Ever get that feeling like, you're watching one of those like true crime movies?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of what we do here.
Well, I mean, particularly like those movies about small towns
Right.
where, everybody knows each other, everybody knows, yeah, their families and all their business, and then suddenly, bam, something terrible happens.
Oh, yeah, like a murder or something that just rocks the whole community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you find out that the killer is like someone you'd never suspect,
Someone who's been hiding in plain sight the whole time.
right? Like the
Yeah.
guy who develops your photos at the local CVS.
Wow. That's a that's a chilling thought.
It is. And that's the reality in
Yeah.
Delphi, Indiana. They're dealing with that right now.
The Delphi murders. Yeah, that case has been haunting people for years.
It has. And just when they thought they finally had some answers with Richard Allen's confession,
Right, the pharmacy technician.
yeah, things just got even more complicated.
Way more complicated.
So today we're gonna take a deep dive into all the details of this confession, the evidence against Allen, and all the controversy surrounding his mental state.
Right, because that could have a huge impact on his trial.
Huge impact. So just to kind of recap for anyone who needs a refresher,
Yeah.
this case goes all the way back to 2017,
2017, that's when Abby Williams and Libby German vanished while hiking.
and their bodies were found the next day.
Tragic.
And perhaps the most chilling detail was that video recovered from Libby's phone.
Right, the one that showed a man walking towards them.
Yeah, and you could hear him say, "down the hill."
That image, that phrase, it just sent shivers down everyone's spines.
Absolutely. And for years, the case remained unsolved.
A real mystery, you know?
And then out of nowhere, Richard Allen's arrested and confesses to the crimes.
It was a shocking development.
Totally. But as we'll discuss, a confession doesn't always equal a clear path to justice.
Especially in a case like this.
Right, and what makes this case even more disturbing is that Richard Allen was not some outsider.
Right, he was a part of the community.
Exactly. He worked at the local CVS, interacted with people every day.
He was even in a photograph with the suspect sketch in the background.
Can you imagine that?
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah.
The guy who might have developed your family photos
Right. Your kid's birthday pictures.
could be responsible for such a horrific act.
It's like a nightmare scenario.
Straight out of a true crime novel.
So let's talk about the evidence against Allen.
Okay.
What led investigators to zero in on him?
Well, first you have Allen's own admission
Yeah, okay.
that he was on the trail when the murders happened.
So he puts himself at the scene of the crime,
Right. And that's significant, obviously.
obviously.
Yeah.
And there were also witnesses who placed him there too, right?
Multiple witnesses described seeing someone who looked like Allen near the trail around the same time the girls disappeared.
So that supports his presence there.
Exactly. It starts to build a case, you know?
Right. And then there's the bullet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a key piece of evidence.
Crucial. They found an unspent bullet at the crime scene.
And forensic analysis linked it to a gun that was registered to Richard Allen.
Wow. So a direct link?
It's pretty damning evidence.
It is, but the most shocking development for me was the confession.
Oh, yeah, the phone call.
The prison phone call with his wife.
I mean, can you imagine being on the other end of that call?
Hearing your husband confess to murder?
It's just chilling. And the way the call ends abruptly,
Yeah, when she realizes what he's saying.
you can just feel the shock through the phone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. The circumstances surrounding this confession are not as simple as they seem.
Not at all. There are a lot of layers here.
Right, because you would think a confession would be the end of it, case closed.
Yeah, you'd think so.
But that's not the whole story.
Nope.
So what happened after the confession?
Well, Alan's behavior in prison starts to change dramatically. He starts losing a lot of weight,
Oh, wow.
acting erratically.
Really?
Yeah, and even eating his legal documents.
Eating his legal documents?
Yeah, it's pretty bizarre.
That doesn't sound like someone who's mentally stable.
That's what a lot of people are saying.
So what does this mean for the case, for the validity of his confession?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
I guess so.
Alan's defense team is now arguing that his confession might not be reliable
Okay.
because of his mental state and the conditions he's been held in.
So they're saying the pressure, the
Right.
isolation, maybe even lack of proper facilities?
Right. All of that could have driven him to confess to something he didn't actually do.
Wait, are they saying he could have confessed falsely just because of the situation he was in?
That's exactly what they're suggesting. They're building a case around the idea that Alan's mental and physical well-being were so compromised that his confession can't be trusted.
That's a pretty complex argument.
It is, and it brings up some big questions about confessions.
Yeah.
What makes a confession truly voluntary and knowing?
And how do you prove someone's state of mind at the time of the confession?
Exactly. It's going to be a fascinating legal battle.
It sounds like things are about to get even more
Oh,
complicated.
absolutely. And there's another wrinkle to this whole thing.
Okay, what's that?
A fellow inmate sent a letter alleging that Alan was being mistreated and threatened in prison.
So basically pressured to confess.
That's the implication, yeah.
Wow. So
Yeah.
we have a confession that might not be reliable.
Right.
A defendant whose mental state is deteriorating.
Yeah.
And a community that's grappling with the idea that someone they knew could be responsible for such a terrible crime.
It's a lot to process.
It is. It's a tangled web. We're going to try to untangle it together.
Sounds good to me. So before we went off there, we were talking about Richard Allen's confession and the questions about his mental state.
Yeah, and how that affects the whole case,
Yeah.
legally speaking.
Right, because confessions, they're often seen as like the slam dunk in a case.
I guess so, yeah.
But legally, it's not always that straightforward.
I mean, I guess not every confession is automatically admissible in court.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. There are rules, there are criteria.
Okay, so what makes a confession legally sound?
Well, it has to be voluntary and knowing,
Voluntary knowing, okay,
meaning the person confessing has to understand what they're doing, you know?
like the consequences of confessing.
Exactly. They can't be coerced or under duress.
So if Allen's defense team can prove that his mental state was messed up,
Right. Or that he was pressured into confessing.
then they could potentially get the confession thrown out.
That's their goal, yeah.
Wow, that would change everything.
It would. The trial would then focus on whether Allen was in his right mind when he confessed.
And whether being in prison actually influenced his decision.
Exactly. And that's a tough thing to prove, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, how do you go back in time and figure out someone's mental state?
Well, it's not easy. There's no time machine, unfortunately.
Right.
But there are procedures, for evaluating someone's mental competency.
So it wouldn't just be Allen saying, oh, I wasn't in my right mind.
No, not at all. Mental health professionals would have to get involved.
Okay, so they would assess Allen's current mental state.
Right. They'd look at his medical history or
Mm-hmm.
maybe do some psychological tests.
And they'd have to present all of that to the court.
Yeah, they'd have to convince the judge and jury that Allen's mental state was so bad that his confession can't be trusted.
And I'm guessing the prosecution will be fighting hard to keep that confession in.
Oh, absolutely. They'll argue that he confessed freely.
That he understood what he was doing.
And that his behavior in prison doesn't automatically mean he's lying.
So they'll probably bring up the fact that he was read his Miranda rights.
Right, and that he had a lawyer.
And that there's no evidence of physical coercion.
Exactly. They'll need to paint a clear picture of his guilt, with or without the confession.
So even if they lose the confession, they'll still need a strong case.
A very strong case.
But going back to Allen's behavior in prison, the weight loss, the eating legal documents,
Yeah.
I mean, does that automatically make him mentally incompetent?
Not necessarily, but it definitely raises some serious concerns.
Right.
The defense will use that to build their case.
To show that he was unstable.
Exactly. They'll say he was under so much pressure that he couldn't think straight.
But could the prosecution just say he's faking it?
They could, and they probably will.
They'll say he's trying to manipulate the system.
Right. They might even suggest that he knows acting crazy could help his case.
So it becomes a battle of the experts then,
Pretty much both sides will bring in their own psychologists and psychiatrists.
and try to convince the jury.
Yeah, it's a high-stakes game for sure.
And for the families of the victims, it must be agonizing.
Oh, absolutely. They're caught in the middle of all this
Waiting for justice.
and hoping that the truth will come out.
Speaking of the truth, we haven't even talked about that letter from the other inmate yet.
Oh, yeah, the one who claimed Allen was being threatened.
Yeah, how much weight does something like that carry in court?
Well, letters from inmates, they're not always seen as reliable,
I guess that makes sense.
especially if the inmate has a reason to lie.
But it could still raise doubts
Definitely. It adds to the overall picture of Allen's situation.
that he was potentially in a vulnerable position.
Right, and that maybe his confession wasn't as voluntary as it seemed.
So we started with a confession that felt like a big breakthrough.
Right, like a turning point.
And now we're back to square one, trying to figure out what really happened.
That's the thing about these complex cases, they rarely have easy answers.
And in this case, the stakes are incredibly high.
Lives were lost, families are devastated.
And the whole community is looking for answers.
It's a heavy burden for everyone involved.
And it makes you think about our justice system, you know.
What do you mean?
Well, we're supposed to believe in due process and the presumption of innocence.
Right. Everyone deserves a fair trial.
But at the same time, we want justice for the victims.
It's a delicate balance.
It is. And sometimes, even when the system works perfectly, it doesn't feel like enough.
Especially in a case like this, where the crime was so horrific.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if we'll ever truly know the whole truth.
That's a question that might haunt this case forever.
It feels like we're in this weird in-between place with this case.
Yeah, kind of like a legal limbo.
Right. We have this confession, but it might not even be admissible.
Exactly, and that throws everything up in the air.
So where do we even go from here? What are the possible outcomes?
Well, let's say the confession is allowed in court,
Okay.
and the prosecution builds a solid case with all the other evidence.
The bullet, the witnesses, all of that.
Right, then it's very likely Richard Allen would be found guilty.
That makes sense, but what if the confession is thrown out? What happens then?
That's the tricky part. The prosecution's case gets a lot weaker.
Because they'd be relying solely on circumstantial evidence.
Exactly. They wouldn't have that direct admission of guilt.
So what kind of circumstantial evidence are we talking about specifically?
Well, you've got the bullet that was linked to Allen's gun,
Right.
the witnesses who placed him near the trail, and any other forensic evidence they might have.
Like DNA or footprints?
Exactly. But the problem is, circumstantial evidence can be interpreted in different ways.
So even with all that evidence, there's still a chance Allen could be acquitted.
It's possible. The defense could argue that just being on the trail doesn't make him a murderer.
And that the witnesses could be mistaken.
Right. Or that the forensic evidence isn't conclusive.
Wow, so even without the confession, it's still a long shot.
It's a tough case, for sure. And for the families of the victims, it's an unimaginable situation.
To think that the person who might have killed their daughters could walk free.
Because of legal technicalities or because the evidence isn't strong enough.
It's heartbreaking. And beyond the legal outcomes, this whole case has brought up some bigger issues.
Definitely like the whole question of what makes a confession reliable.
But how much weight should a confession carry if someone's mental state is in question?
Right. And how do we balance the rights of the accused with the need for justice?
It's a complex situation with no easy answers.
And it really highlights the imperfections of our justice system.
That sometimes even when the system works the way it's supposed to, it doesn't feel like enough.
Especially in a case like this where the crime was so senseless and the pain is so deep.
This case has really left its mark on the community of Delphi.
And on everyone who's followed it.
It's a reminder that evil can exist anywhere.
Even in the most unexpected places.
And that the search for truth and justice can be a long and difficult road.
A road with many twists and turns.
This case is far from over. We'll continue to follow it and keep you updated.
Oh, we will.
But for now, we want to leave you with this thought. If a confession's here, something that we often see is the ultimate proof of guilt.
Great, the smoking gun.
If that could be so easily questioned, what does that mean for other cases?
Cases where confessions played a key role.
How do we make sure that justice is served while also protecting the rights of everyone involved?
It's a question we all need to be thinking about.
It's a question that goes beyond this one case. It's a question about our values and our beliefs about justice and fairness.
It's a question that will probably stay with us long after this case is closed.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Delphi murders.
It's been a fascinating and unsettling journey.
We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a different case. Until then, keep those critical thinking caps on.
And remember, the truth is out there somewhere.